The healers had already packed their satchels when Nellie arrived. She noticed it before she noticed anything else. The smell of abandonment, which was different from the smell of death. Death smelled like iron and cold earth. Abandonment smelled like beeswax candles snuffed too soon, like lavender bundles removed from a sick room, like the particular silence that follows a decision already made. The corridor outside the young lord's chamber held all three, layered so thick she had to breathe through her mouth just to keep walking. 3 senior healers stood near the arched doorway. Master Aldrich, the eldest, had his back to the room. He was retying the leather straps of his bag with the calm, unhurried movements of a man who had already said his prayers and made his peace. Beside him, Healer Warren and young Petra exchanged quiet words, their voices low enough to sound like insects, not people. None of them looked at her when she stopped at the threshold. "You're leaving," Nellie said. It was not a question. Master Aldrich turned. He had kind eyes. She'd always thought so. The sort of pale gray eyes that made the ill feel safe. But tonight those eyes held something she had never seen in them before. Not grief, not failure. Something far worse than both. "There is nothing more to be done," he said. "The fever has gone too deep. The boy's wolf is not responding. We have administered every herb in our stores. Wolfsbane extract, moonroot tea, cold compress of pine and river clay. His body is rejecting all of it." "He's still breathing," Nellie said. "Barely." She looked past them into the room. The chamber was large, as befitted the son of the Alpha King. Stone walls hung with tapestries of midnight blue and silver. A great hearth at the far end where the fire had burned down to red coals. A carved oak bed with a dark canopy. And in that bed, a shape so still it barely disturbed the linen, Cale, the Alpha King's only son. 22 years old, tall like his father, black-haired like his father, and right now as pale and motionless as the stone effigies on the tombs in the lower chapel. "His father returns from the northern campaign in 3 days," Nellie said. "We know," Aldrich replied quietly. "And you plan to tell the Alpha King that his son died while the royal healers were packing their bags and walking away." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Petra looked at the floor. Warren cleared his throat, but Aldrich met her gaze without flinching, which she respected even now, even furious. "We plan to tell the Alpha King that his son's illness surpassed the limits of what mortal healing can accomplish," he said. "Which is the truth, Nellie. You know our craft as well as any apprentice in this keep. You know what it means when the wolf goes silent inside a shifter. The inner beast is what pulls them back from the edge. Without it responding, without the pack bond supplying strength, there is no path forward. I am sorry." He said it like a man who meant it. That was almost worse. "I'll stay," she said. Aldrich paused with his satchel half raised. "You are an Omega with 2 years of healer's apprenticeship, no rank, no pack of your own, and no—" "I know what I am," Nellie said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, but steadier than she felt. "I'll stay anyway." He studied her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not contempt. Not quite pity either. Something in between that she had learned, in 23 years of life as an Omega, in a kingdom run by alphas and betas, to absorb without letting it reach the place inside her that still felt things. "As you wish," he said at last. "It will make no difference." They left. Their footsteps faded down the corridor, and then the keep was quiet, and Nellie was alone with the dying son of the most powerful Alpha King in 3 kingdoms. She did not waste time on the feelings that wanted to rise. She crossed to the bed, set her own small satchel on the side table, and pressed the back of her hand to Cale's forehead. The heat was extraordinary. Not like fever she had tended before. This was a burning from inside. A furnace heat that seemed to pulse in rhythms too slow and too wrong to be natural. His skin was clammy at the temples but scorching along the jaw. His dark hair clung to his neck. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored intervals, that made her count each one without meaning to. She had known Kale for 4 years. Not well. An Omega apprentice did not know the Alpha King's son well. Not in any world that made sense. But she had assisted in the training hall once, when a young warrior's shoulder was dislocated and none of the senior healers were near. Kale had been there. He had looked at her with dark blue eyes and said simply, "Can you help him?" And when she said yes, he had stepped back and let her work without questioning her rank or her blood. She had not forgotten that. Small things had a way of staying with her longer than grand ones. Now she pulled the linen back and examined him properly, the way Aldrich had taught her, and the way her own instinct refined it. The fever had been 3 days old when she arrived. The pack healers had treated it as a standard wolf fever at first. Aggressive, yes, but responsive to moonroot and rest. It was only on the second day that they understood something else was wrong. The inner wolf, the beast that every shifter carried like a second heartbeat, had gone completely silent. That was not natural. That was not illness. Nellie reached into her satchel with deliberate hands and removed what she had brought. A small clay pot of rendered beeswax mixed with pine resin, a bundle of dried silver leaf. Not for fever, but for the wolf connection, which was different. A strip of undyed wool, a vial of cold spring water she had collected herself from the stream below the keep's eastern wall at moonrise 2 nights ago, and a small iron bowl. She had not told Aldrich she had these things, partly because she was not certain they would work, partly because what she was about to attempt was not precisely in any healer's text she had ever been given access to. It was older than the texts. It was the kind of knowledge that got passed between Omega women in whispers, in kitchens and laundry rooms, in the brief and guarded moments when no Alpha was listening. Omegas feel what others cannot. That was the whisper. When the wolf inside a shifter goes silent, it is not gone. It is hiding. And a silent wolf will sometimes answer what a loud command cannot reach. She did not know if she believed it. But Kale was dying, and the senior healers had gone home, and she was still here. She built the fire back up herself, carrying wood from the stack near the hearth in 3 trips until the flames rose gold and steady. Then she pulled the wooden chair to the side of the bed, settled into it, and began. She heated the iron bowl over the flame until it was warm, not hot, and added the spring water and a few torn silver leaf stems. The smell that rose was cold and green and faintly sweet. The smell of forests at dawn, of deep places where wolves ran alone. She did not speak any invocation. She was not a priestess of the moon goddess, and she would not pretend otherwise. What she did instead was simpler and stranger. She placed her hand over his chest, not touching, hovering just above the linen, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him. And she stayed there. She stayed the way that Omega women had always stayed, not because they were weak, but because stillness was its own kind of power, and presence was its own kind of language, and sometimes the only thing a wounded creature needed to survive the night was the knowledge that something warm and alive and willing was nearby. Outside, rain began. It struck the tall windows in long diagonal lines, and the torches in the corridor beyond the closed door guttered in the draft, and the keep settled into the deep silence of a place holding its breath. Nellie sat beside the Alpha King's son and did not leave. Hours passed. She did not count them. And then, so small she almost missed it, she felt something shift beneath her palm. Not his chest. Not his breathing. Something else. Something deeper. Like a sound heard through stone walls, felt rather than heard. A low and distant vibration that rose for one moment, and then fell away again. Her breath caught. She leaned slightly closer. "I know you're in there," she said, barely above a whisper. "You don't have to answer yet, but I'm not leaving." The fire crackled. The rain continued. Kale's lashes did not move. His breathing did not change. But Nellie would have sworn, would have staked whatever small worth the world assigned to her, that for just one instant, the temperature beneath her hovering palm dropped by the precise measure of something listening. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the kind that did not so much arrive as seep. A slow lightening of the window glass, the rain reduced to a fine mist that clung to the stone ledge like breath. Nellie had not slept. She was aware of this the way she was aware of hunger or cold, as a fact of the body, noted and set aside. Cale's fever had not broken, but it had not climbed further either. She considered that carefully, the way she considered everything, without rushing to conclusions that comfort wanted to provide. He was the same. Perhaps that was nothing. Perhaps it meant the illness had simply reached its ceiling and would hold there until his body gave out entirely. But something in her, the part that had felt that strange pulse in the dark hours before midnight, did not believe that. Something had shifted, not enough to celebrate, enough to continue. She replaced the water in the iron bowl, adding fresh silver leaf and a pinch of pine resin that she ground between her palms until the oil released, sharp and clean, cutting through the stale air of the sick room. She wiped Cale's forehead with a strip of undyed wool soaked in the cooled liquid, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned that grace under pressure looked a great deal like patience. The door opened. She did not startle. She had heard the footstep in the corridor 3 seconds before the latch moved, which was one of the things about herself she had stopped trying to explain. Her senses were uncommonly sharp for an Omega. They always had been. The senior healers found it useful when they remembered it, and inconvenient when they forgot. The woman who entered was not a healer. She was perhaps 50 years of age, broad-shouldered and straight-spined in the manner of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to shrink. Her gray hair was braided and pinned, her dress dark wool, her eyes the particular sharp brown of a person who catalogued everything they saw and forgot very little of it. Nellie recognized her. Lady Marin, the Keep's head of household, who had run the domestic affairs of Ashenvale Keep for longer than Nellie had been alive. Lady Marin looked at the empty chairs where 3 senior healers had sat for 2 days. Then she looked at Nellie. Her expression moved through several things in quick succession, and settled on something that was not quite approval, but was adjacent to respect. "You're the Omega girl," she said, not unkindly, simply accurately. "Nellie," she replied, "apprentice healer. Aldrich's apprentice." "Until last night, yes." Lady Marin crossed to the other side of the bed and looked down at Cale with an expression that dropped every pretense of household efficiency for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Nellie saw what the woman actually felt, and it was grief of the specific, devastating kind that belonged to people who had watched a child grow from infancy. Then it was gone, folded back behind the capable face of a woman who had work to do. "His father arrives in 2 days," Lady Marin said. "Not 3. A rider came at first light. The campaign ended a day early." Nellie absorbed this. "Then I have less time than I thought." "Less time for what, exactly?" The woman's voice was not hostile. It was the voice of someone who genuinely needed an answer before she could decide whether to help. Nellie considered how much to say. She looked at Cale, at the gray white of his face, the stillness that was too close to the stillness of stone, and made a decision. "The wolf inside him is hiding," she said. "Not gone. Hiding. Something frightened it badly enough that it retreated past the reach of conventional treatment. Moonroot and wolfsbane treat the body. What Cale needs is something that speaks to the wolf directly, something that reminds it that it is safe enough to surface." Lady Marin was quiet for a moment. "And you believe you can do this?" "I believe I am the only one still trying," Nellie said. Another silence. Then Lady Marin moved to the door, opened it, and spoke briefly to someone in the corridor. A servant, by the sound of the retreating footsteps. When she returned, she positioned herself in the chair against the far wall, not interfering, not hovering, simply present, and said nothing more. Nellie understood. She had been given permission to continue. That was enough. The morning passed in slow layers. She tended the bowl, refreshed the compress, kept the fire steady. She spoke occasionally. Not to Cale specifically. not in the manner of someone expecting response, but in the low and even tone that she had discovered, through years of sitting beside ill and frightened creatures both human and wolf, had a quieting effect regardless of whether the listener was conscious. She spoke of small things, the rain outside, the smell of pine resin, the fact that the gray cat who lived in the keep's lower kitchen had produced a litter of 4 and was insufferably proud of herself. She did not speak of his father. She did not speak of the campaign. She did not speak of death or recovery or what was expected of an Alpha King's son. She gave him nothing that required him to be anything. She simply let him exist in the room without demand. It was mid-morning when Cale moved, not dramatically. Not the way the old ballads describe the ill returning from the edge. No gasped breath, no sudden opening of eyes, no miraculous color flooding back. His fingers moved. The smallest possible motion, the index finger of his left hand curling fractionally against the linen, as though reaching for something in sleep. Then still again. Nellie set down the compress. She leaned forward. "Cale," she said quietly. Nothing. But the finger had moved. She had not imagined it. She reached out, carefully, giving him every chance to register the approach before contact, and placed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist, where the pulse lived. It was still thin, still too fast. But it had a quality now. A faint irregularity that she recognized not as weakness, but as effort, as something trying. "Your wolf is working," she told him, very low. "Whatever it's afraid of, it's pushing back. Help it." Lady Marin from her chair across the room said nothing, but Nellie heard her exhale. The hours that followed were the longest of the watch. The fever moved strangely, dropping 1/2 degree, climbing 1/4, dropping again, an irregular oscillation that would have worried Aldrich into intervention, but that Nellie read differently. It was a struggle, internal, the wolf surfacing and submerging in turns, the body rising and falling with it, a tide against a tide. She did not intervene further with medicines. She kept the room clean and warm and smelling of pine and silverleaf. She stayed. Cale opened his eyes for the first time at the hour when the afternoon light slanted low, an amber through the western window, falling across the carved footboard of the bed in a stripe of gold. It was the kind of light that made everything look briefly sacred, even sick rooms. His eyes were dark blue, very dark, the color of deep water in a shadow, or the sky in the last minute before full dark. They opened and stared at the canopy above him, with the unfocused quality of someone returning from a very long distance. Nellie did not move. She waited. Slowly, those eyes tracked sideways. Found her. She watched him process her. The small face, the blonde braid, the gray apprentice's cloak, the complete absence of any senior healer's marks or rank insignia. She watched him decide she was real. She watched him try to speak and discover that his throat had been dry for 3 days. She was already reaching for the wooden cup on the side table. She lifted his head with one hand. He was heavier than he looked, or she was more tired than she had admitted, and brought the cup to his lips. He drank. Not much. Enough. "Where?" he started. His voice was barely there. "Ashenvale Keep. Your own chamber," she said. "You've been ill for 3 days. Your fever is beginning to break." He was quiet for a moment, visibly working through this. Then, "The healers. They left last night." Another pause. The dark blue eyes moved back to her face with an expression she could not entirely read. "But you didn't." "No," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that had nothing performative in it. No alpha assessment. No rank calculation. Just a man who had been very close to dying, looking at the person who had stayed. "Why?" he said. Nellie considered the question. There were several honest answers. Because she believed his wolf was still there. Because the senior healers had been wrong, and she had known it. Because she had been an Omega her entire life, and had learned that the things which required endurance were precisely the things that no one with a choice would choose to endure, which meant someone had to. She chose the simplest true thing. Because someone needed to, she said. Cale said nothing. He closed his eyes again, not in unconsciousness. She could tell the difference now, but in the particular exhaustion of someone who had just fought something enormous and won, barely, and needed to rest before they could face what came next. Outside, a commotion rose in the lower courtyard. Horses, many horses, the sound of iron-shod hooves on cobblestone, the ring of armor, the deep resonance of commands given in a voice accustomed to being obeyed across distances. Nellie stood and moved to the window. Below, through the gray mist of the afternoon, she saw the column entering the keep's main gate. War horses, black caparisoned, soldiers in dark leather with the silver wolf sigil of the Ashenvale crown, torches lit in broad daylight against the overcast sky, because when a king returned, you lit the torches regardless of the hour. And at the front of the column, on a black horse that was almost too large to be real, a figure that even from 3 stories above and through misted glass made every instinct in Nellie's body go very, very still. The Alpha King had arrived 1 full day early, and his son, in the bed behind her, had just barely lived long enough to receive him. She heard him before she saw him clearly. Not his voice. Not yet. But his presence moved through the keep, the way a storm front moved through open country. Something in the air changed. A pressure shift. A charge that made the fine hairs on her arms rise beneath her linen sleeves. The servants in the corridor outside quickened their steps. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn differently, sharper, more upright, as though even the flames recognized authority and adjusted accordingly. Nellie turned from the window. She smoothed her gray cloak with both hands, which was a useless gesture, and she knew it. She had been awake for the better part of a day and a night. Her braid was half undone, her apprentice's cloak was wrinkled and smelled of pine resin and silver leaf, and the particular exhaustion that soaked into fabric when worn too long. She looked exactly like what she was, an Omega with no rank who had spent the night alone in a sick room doing what trained healers had declared impossible. There was no version of this in which she looked appropriate. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. The door opened without a knock. Kings did not knock in their own keeps. Tristan of Ashenvale filled the doorway in a way that was not entirely about physical size, though he was large, broad through the chest and shoulders in the manner of a man who had spent 20 years at war, not merely watching it. He wore his campaign armor still, dark leather with iron reinforcements, straps crossing his chest, bracers on his forearms, a mane of black braids pushed back from his face and bound loosely, the kind of hair that had been braided for a campaign and not touched since. There was a healing cut along his left cheekbone, shallow but recent, 2 days old at most, she estimated automatically, the way healers always did. His eyes were the same dark blue as his son's. She registered that with a small, strange lurch. She had not expected it. The identical color, the same depth. But where Cale's eyes had been unfocused with fever and distance, Tristan's were completely, uncomfortably present. They moved through the room in one sweep. The dying fire, the iron bowl, the silver leaf stems, the strip of undyed wool, the empty chairs where 3 royal healers had sat. And then they found her. He stopped. Not because she was remarkable. She knew that. He stopped because he was a man reading a room, and the room was telling him something he had not expected to find. "Where is Master Aldrich?" he said. His voice was exactly what she had anticipated from the sound of it below in the courtyard. Low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry weight. "He left last night," Nellie said. "All 3 senior healers. They determined that Lord Cale's condition had progressed beyond what conventional treatment could address." A silence. Not a comfortable one. "They left my son," Tristan said. The sentence was completely flat. That flatness was, she suspected, considerably more dangerous than shouting would have been. "Yes," she said. His gaze moved past her to the bed. She watched something move across his face, the same thing she had seen in Lady Marin's expression that morning. the grief that powerful people allowed themselves for only a few seconds before discipline reclaimed it. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stood at his son's bedside, and for a moment, he was simply a father looking at his child, and Nellie looked at the window to give him that without an audience. She heard him exhale slowly. "He's breathing differently," Tristan said. "His fever began breaking approximately 2 hours ago," she said, still looking at the window. "His wolf responded sometime in the night. He regained consciousness this afternoon, briefly, coherent, able to swallow water. He's sleeping naturally now, not the unconsciousness of crisis. The distinction is significant." Another silence. Longer this time. "Turn around," he said. She did. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not suspicion, not gratitude, not the particular condescension that alphas often aimed at omegas without even being aware of it. Something more careful than any of those. "You did this," he said. Not a question. "I stayed," she said. "His wolf did the rest." "Aldrich has 40 years of training," Tristan said, and his voice carried no hostility, only the weight of someone trying to understand something that did not yet make sense to him. "He and his healers had every resource in the royal stores. You are—" He paused, and she could see him register the absence of rank markings on her cloak. "An apprentice." "Yes," she said. "An Omega apprentice." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze, because she had learned, in 23 years, that looking away from alphas was something they interpreted as submission, and then immediately forgot about you, whereas meeting their eyes sometimes made them actually see you. It was a narrow calculation, and it required steadiness she did not entirely feel right now, with exhaustion pressing behind her eyes and her knees carrying more weight than she wanted to admit. "What did you do?" he said, that 3 senior healers did not. She thought about deflecting, about the humble answer, the deferential answer, the answer that made her invisible again and therefore safe. She had spent a great deal of her life choosing that answer. "I stayed," she said again. Aldrich treated the fever. He was not wrong to do so. The fever was real and required treatment. But the fever was a symptom, not the source. Something frightened Lord Kael's wolf into retreat. A wolf that has retreated that deeply does not respond to medicine. It responds to presence, to the knowledge that the threat has passed and something safe is nearby. "And you provided that," he said. "I attempted to," she said carefully. "I cannot tell you with certainty that what I did caused his recovery. I can tell you that I am the only one who was here when it happened." Something shifted in Tristan's expression. Very slight. The careful look deepened into something more specific. The look of a man recalibrating. "What is your name?" he said. "Nellie. Of no house." She said it the way she always said it. Without apology. Without the flicker of shame that the world had been trying to install in her for as long as she could remember. It was true, and truth did not require an apology. "Nellie of no house," he repeated, and something in the way he said it was not dismissive. He seemed to be placing it somewhere in his mind, filing it with intention. "You will remain in this keep until my son is fully recovered." It was not phrased as a request. "I planned to," she said. His eyes moved over her face, not calculating, not assessing rank or usefulness. Something else. Something that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than necessary before he looked back at his son. "Lady Marin will see to your accommodation and meals. You will have access to whatever stores you require." He paused. "And Nellie, my lord, you will tell me when Aldrich returns to this keep so that I may speak with him." The way he said speak made it clear that what he intended bore no resemblance to conversation. "Yes, my lord," she said. He stayed at Kael's bedside for a long time after that. Nellie moved quietly to the far end of the room and occupied herself with organizing her satchel and refreshing the silver leaf in the bowl and doing the small, quiet work of someone who understood how to be present without intruding. She was very good at that. She had been practicing it her entire life. Cale woke again near dusk. This time his eyes were clearer, still exhausted, still carrying the hollowed quality of someone who had lost days to illness, but present in a way they had not been before. He turned his head and found his father, and something passed between them that required no words, and that Nellie had no business watching. She studied the grain of the wooden shutter beside the window with great interest. She heard Cale's voice, rough but steadier. "You're early." And Tristan's, quieter than she had yet heard it. "Yes. The campaign is finished. It will keep." A pause. Then Cale said something lower that she could not make out, and Tristan replied in the same register, and whatever passed between them in those few quiet sentences settled something in the room's atmosphere, a tension she had not fully noticed until it eased. Then Cale said, clearly enough to Carrie, "The girl who stayed, is she still here?" "She is," Tristan said. "Good," Cale said. "I want to thank her properly when I'm less humiliating to look at." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the stiffness in her back from the wooden chair, the strange suspended quality of the last 20 hours, Nellie felt the corner of her mouth move. She did not let it become a smile, but it was close. What she did not anticipate, could not have anticipated, was what happened 3 days later. Cale recovered with the speed that young shifters recovered when their wolf finally engaged, faster than seemed reasonable, each morning showing more color, more steadiness, more of the sharp alertness that she suspected was his natural state. By the second day, he was sitting upright and eating properly. By the third, he was arguing with Lady Marin about whether he was strong enough to walk the corridor, which Nellie took as a reliable sign that he was nearly well. On the morning of the fourth day, a guard came to the small room Lady Marin had arranged for her, a modest space near the healer's wing, clean and warm, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the herb garden, and informed her that the Alpha King requested her presence in the great hall. Not the sick room, not the healer's wing. The great hall. Nellie dressed carefully, which for her meant shaking out the least wrinkled of her 2 linen gowns, rebraiding her blonde hair neatly from temple to tail, and fastening her gray cloak at the throat with the small pewter clasp that had been her mother's. She had no finery. She had never owned any. She presented herself as what she was, as she always did, and walked through the stone corridors of Ashenvale Keep with her hands folded and her spine straight. The great hall was not empty. Tristan sat in the carved chair at the head of the long table, not the throne room, she noted, but not a private meeting either. Lady Marin stood to one side. 2 senior guards flanked the main doors, and seated along one side of the table, looking considerably less comfortable than their status suggested they should be, were Master Aldrich, Healer Warren, and young Petra. The healers had returned. Nellie stopped just inside the doorway and understood, in the space of one breath, exactly what kind of room she had walked into. Tristan's dark blue eyes found her immediately. He said nothing, but he gestured once to the chair directly across the table from the 3 healers, and that gesture, measured and deliberate, told her precisely where she stood in this proceeding before a single word was spoken. She crossed the hall and sat down. Master Aldrich did not look at her when she sat down. That told her everything she needed to know about how he intended to conduct himself in this room. Warren studied the table. Petra, to her credit, looked directly at Nellie with an expression that held something uncomfortable in it. Not quite guilt, but its younger, less resolved cousin. Tristan let the silence sit for a moment after Nellie took her seat. He was good at silence, she had noticed. He used it the way skilled craftsmen used a good tool, deliberately, without waste, to accomplish something specific. This particular silence accomplished the thing of making 3 senior healers acutely aware that they were being observed by a man who had not yet decided what he thought of them. Then he spoke. "Master Aldrich," he said, "I would like you to explain to me in plain language what you told my son's attendants when you left his chamber 4 nights ago." Aldrich straightened. He had clearly prepared for this. His voice, when it came, was measured and calm, the voice of a man presenting a professional assessment. My lord, Lord Kale presented with a wolf suppression fever of a severity I have not encountered in 40 years of practice. Every treatment protocol available to us was administered. When his inner wolf failed to respond after 48 hours of continuous treatment, and when his vital signs indicated irreversible decline, I made the determination that further intervention would constitute a prolongation of suffering, rather than a genuine path to recovery. I stand by that assessment as the most ethical course available to me at the time. Tristan listened to all of this without moving. And the Omega apprentice you left behind, he said. What was your assessment of her decision to remain? A pause, shorter than it should have been. I considered it the well-intentioned gesture of an inexperienced girl who did not yet fully understand the limits of what healing can accomplish, Aldrich said. I did not forbid her from staying. I simply informed her that it would make no difference. And yet, Tristan said, it did. Aldrich's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My lord, the recovery of Lord Kale is, naturally, something I rejoice in. However, I would caution against drawing a direct line between the apprentice's presence and his survival. Wolf suppression fevers occasionally resolve spontaneously. The treatments we administered over the preceding 2 days may have taken effect after our departure. There is no way to establish with certainty that... Aldrich. The name, said quietly, stopped him completely. My son told me what he remembers from his fever, Tristan said. Not much. Fever does not preserve memory cleanly. But he remembers a voice. Speaking of ordinary things. Not commanding him to fight, not invoking the moon goddess, not administering medicines. Speaking of a cat, Petra made a small sound that she converted immediately into a cough. He said that voice was the first thing that felt safe in 3 days, Tristan continued, his tone unchanged, perfectly level. He said that when he heard it, something in him that had been very far away began to come back. He paused. You have 40 years of training, Aldrich. She has 2. Explain to me why your 40 years walked out of that room and her 2 years did not. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. This one had weight. Aldrich said nothing. There was nothing, Nellie thought, that he could say. Not without either lying or arriving at a truth that was uncomfortable for a man of his standing to speak aloud. That the training was not the thing that had mattered. That the rank was not the thing that had mattered, that sometimes the most sophisticated tool was not the right one, and the one that no one valued was. Tristan turned his gaze to Nellie. I would like you to tell me, he said, what you did, in your own words, not a healer's assessment, what you actually did and why. She was aware of the 3 healers watching her. She was aware of Lady Marin at the wall. She was aware that this room was a proceeding of some kind, that what happened in it would have consequences she could not fully predict, and that honesty was both the right choice and the only one she was capable of. I kept the room warm and clean, she said. I used silverleaf in warm water because it carries the scent of deep forest, the kind of place a wolf feels safe. I did not administer it as medicine. I let it exist in the air of the room. I spoke to him. Not because I believed he could consciously hear me, but because I have sat with enough frightened creatures to know that the sound of a calm voice registers even when the mind cannot process it. She paused. And I stayed. I did not leave when it seemed pointless. I did not leave when it seemed hopeless. I stayed because I believed his wolf was still there, and because I thought, if it were me, lost that far inside myself, I would want someone to stay. The room was very quiet. Tristan looked at her for a long moment. That same look from the sick room, the recalibrating look, the look that was putting her somewhere specific in his understanding of things. You believed his wolf was still present, he said. How? I felt it, she said simply. Approximately 2 hours after the senior healers left, I felt a pulse beneath my hand that was not fever and was not heartbeat. Something deeper. Something that responded. Omegas feel what others cannot, Lady Marin said quietly from the wall. It was the first thing she had said since Nellie entered the room. "Old superstition," Aldrich said, and could not quite keep the dismissiveness from his voice despite the room he was in. Tristan looked at Aldrich for exactly 2 seconds. "The old superstition saved my son's life," he said. "I suggest you revise your estimation of it." Aldrich said nothing more. What followed was not a formal sentencing. Tristan was not that kind of king, she was beginning to understand. He did not punish through spectacle. He did not humiliate for the pleasure of it. But he was precise, and his precision was its own form of consequence. He informed Aldrich that his position as head of the Royal Healers was suspended, pending a full review of his protocols. He informed all 3 that they would provide written accounts of every treatment administered, every decision made, and every assessment recorded over the course of Lord Kael's illness. He informed them that an Omega healer from the northern provinces, a woman named Brenna, whose reputation for wolf intuition medicine he had apparently known about for some time, would be brought in to review those accounts alongside a council of healers from the Eastern Territories. He said all of this without raising his voice. When the 3 healers had been dismissed, and the sound of their footsteps had faded down the corridor, Tristan remained at the head of the table. Lady Marin had slipped out after them, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood when a room needed fewer people. Nellie stayed seated, waiting, her hands folded in her lap, because she had not been dismissed, and because she had learned that waiting in stillness was almost always better than filling silence with words. "You have no house," Tristan said. "No, my lord. No pack. No. No family in this territory. My mother died when I was 11, she said. I was taken on as a kitchen girl at the healer's house in the village of Karath. Master Aldrich recognized my aptitude when I was 16 and brought me here as an apprentice." She paused. "Which means that as of last night, I am no longer an apprentice under anyone, and have no formal standing in this keep." She said it without bitterness. It was simply true, and truth required neither decoration nor apology. Tristan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the map spread across the table when she had passed the open door of his war room that morning, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was not yet finished thinking. "I am going to offer you a position," he said. She had not expected that. She kept her face still, though something in her chest moved. "Not as an apprentice," he continued. "That rank no longer seems accurate. I am going to create a position, healer's companion to the Alpha household, which will give you formal standing in this keep, access to all healers' stores, and the authority to treat any member of my household without requiring approval from a senior healer." He paused. "You will be compensated accordingly. You will have permanent quarters. You will answer to me directly." The fire in the great hall hearth crackled. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the courtyard, hooves on cobblestone. "Why?" she said. Not suspicion. She had learned from Kael that the question could be asked honestly. Something moved in Tristan's expression. Not quite a smile. She was not sure his face knew how to do that easily, but something adjacent to it. A lightening. "Because someone needed to," he said. Her own words. Returned to her with a precision that told her he had not forgotten them, had held them somewhere specific, and retrieved them intentionally. She looked at him across the long table, this king with his dark braids and his campaign-worn armor, and his eyes the same color as his son's, and felt something she had not expected to feel in this room or this keep, or possibly at any point in a life that had given her very little reason to feel it. Safe. Not in the way of walls and warmth. Safer than that. The kind of safety that came from being seen by someone with the power to dismiss you, and being kept instead. She was careful with it. She had learned to be careful with feelings that arrived without warning in the presence of powerful people. She set it to one side, and addressed only what required addressing. "I accept," she said. "Good," Tristan said. He rose from the carved chair and moved toward the door with the unhurried stride of a man who carried authority the way other men carried breath. Without thinking about it, without performing it, simply as a natural property of existing. At the doorway he paused, and she thought for a moment he would say something more. Instead, he looked back at her over his shoulder, and the look was brief and direct, and carried nothing in it that she could have named precisely. Only that it made her feel again that she had been placed somewhere specific in his understanding of things. Then he was gone, and the great hall was quiet, and the fire burned steadily in the hearth, and Nellie sat alone at the long table with her hands folded and something warm moving carefully through her chest. She stayed there for a moment, allowing herself that much. Then she rose, straightened her gray cloak, and went to tend her patient. Winter came to Ashenvale Keep, the way it always did. Not suddenly, but with the slow and certain patience of something that had been waiting all along. The herb garden outside Nellie's window went gray and still. The corridors acquired a cold that the torches along the walls softened, but never fully defeated. The great hearths burned from morning until long past midnight, and the smell of the keep shifted from summer's pine and dust to something heavier and warmer. Wood smoke, rendered tallow, the particular sweetness of dried lavender pressed against cold stone. Nellie learned the keep, the way she learned everything, slowly, carefully, by staying. She learned which guards took their posts seriously, and which ones needed watching. She learned that Lady Marin kept dried chamomile behind the kitchen stores for headaches she would never admit to having. She learned that the east corridor was 2 degrees colder than any other passage in the keep, and that the gray cat from the lower kitchen, whose name she discovered was Mab, had decided to relocate her litter to the warmth of the healer's wing and could not be persuaded otherwise. She learned that Cale, once recovered, was exactly the kind of person she had suspected from their brief exchange in his sick room. Direct, without cruelty. Curious, without condescension. He came to the healer's wing 3 weeks after his fever broke, moving with the recovered ease of a young man whose wolf had fully re-engaged, and he sat in the chair across from her workbench and thanked her with a straightforwardness that required no ceremony. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "I know," she said. "It matters," he said, "that you did. I want you to know that it matters." She looked at him, this young lord with his dark blue eyes and his honest face, and understood that he meant it without complication, without agenda, without any of the layers that power usually wrapped around simple things. She nodded once, and that was sufficient, and they did not speak of it again. What they spoke of instead, over the weeks that followed, were books. He was a reader, she discovered, with a particular interest in old pack histories, and herbology, which interested him more than it did most warriors' sons, and the question of whether Mab's kittens would eventually be persuaded to return to the lower kitchen. They would not. She had already accepted this. Cale became, quietly and without announcement, the closest thing to a friend she had known since childhood. She was careful about Tristan. Not because she feared him. She had discovered quite early that he was not the kind of man one needed to fear if one was honest. But because she understood the difference between warmth and foolishness, and she had seen enough women mistake powerful men's attention for something personal when it was merely thoroughness. But he was thorough in ways that were difficult to dismiss. He came to the healer's wing himself when one of his senior guards took a blade wound in a training accident, rather than sending a servant with instructions. He stayed while she cleaned and dressed the wound, not hovering, not interfering, simply present. And he asked questions, good ones, the kind that told her he was actually listening to the answers. He sent word through Lady Marin when Brenna, the healer from the northern provinces, arrived to conduct her review of Aldrich's protocols, not informing Nellie, but asking whether she would be willing to meet with Brenna and share her account of Cale's illness. The asking mattered. She had been in enough rooms where Omega women were informed, rather than consulted, to know the difference in her chest before she knew it in her mind. Brenna was a woman of perhaps 60, weathered and precise, with the particular manner of someone who had spent decades being right about things and had no need to announce it. She listened to Nellie's account without interrupting, asked 3 very exact questions at the end, and then said briskly, "The silver leaf in warm water was correct. The continuous presence was correct. The avoidance of command-based stimulus was correct. You did what I would have done." Then she left to write her report, and Nellie sat with that for a long time afterward, The review concluded in early winter. Aldrich's position was not restored. A new arrangement was established. A council of healers rather than a single senior authority, with Nellie holding a formal seat on that council as the Alpha household's designated healer. Brenna wrote it into her report as a recommendation, and Tristan enacted it within a fortnight. The night the appointment was made formal, Lady Marin appeared at Nellie's door with a cup of spiced wine and the expression of a woman who had decided to be satisfied with how things had turned out. "You should sleep," Lady Marin said, handing her the cup. "I know," Nellie said. "You won't," Lady Marin said with the accuracy of someone who had been watching her for 3 months. She was right. Nellie sat by her window with the spiced wine cooling in her hands and looked out at the keep's inner courtyard, where the first snow of winter had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes that caught the torchlight and turned briefly gold before settling on the cobblestones below. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, unhurried, heavy, the particular rhythm of boots she had learned to recognize without meaning to, and then a quiet knock at her door. She opened it. Tristan stood in the corridor in a dark wool tunic without armor, his black braids loose over one shoulder, a small object in his hand that she could not immediately identify. He looked different without the campaign leather, not lesser. Nothing about him suggested lesser, but more present somehow, more singular. "You're awake," he said. "Yes," she said. He held out the object in his hand. It was a brooch, silver, small, worked into the shape of a wolf mid-stride. Not ornate, not the kind of thing that shouted wealth, the kind of thing that was made to last. "The formal appointment carries a household mark," he said. "Lady Marin was meant to give this to you this evening, but she informed me she forgot." He paused. She did not forget. She does not forget things. Despite everything, Nellie felt the corner of her mouth move toward something. "No," she agreed. "She doesn't." She took the brooch from his hand. The silver was warm from being held. He had been carrying it for some time. She looked at it for a moment, the small wolf mid-stride, and then looked up at him. "There is something I want to say to you," Tristan said. "That is separate from the appointment, and from the council, and from all of it." She waited. "When I rode into this keep 2 months ago," he said, "and found my son breathing and his healers gone, what I felt in that moment is not something I have adequate language for." He said it without drama, which made it land harder than drama would have. "And then I found you, an Omega with no house and no rank who had spent the night alone in that room, doing what 40 years of trained expertise had declared impossible, because you believed it was possible, and because you thought that if it were you would want someone to stay." She said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. "I have known many capable people," he said. "Soldiers, advisors, healers, lords. Capability is common enough at its base. What you did was not capability." He paused. "It was something rarer. And I find that I am aware of it, consistently." The snow continued to fall in the courtyard beyond her window. The torch in the corridor between them burned very steadily, and in its light, his dark blue eyes held an expression she had spent 2 months being careful about, and could no longer entirely manage to dismiss. "Tristan," she said, and his name in her mouth without the title felt like stepping onto ice. Not wrong, but requiring attention. "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You have a position here that is yours regardless. I am not—" He stopped, and she saw him choose words with the care of a man who rarely had to choose them. "I am not telling you this to place you in a difficult situation. I am telling you because I have discovered that I am not particularly skilled at being aware of something and saying nothing about it indefinitely." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sat at his son's bedside and allowed himself 3 seconds of grief before returning to function, who had said "speak with" when he meant something considerably more serious, who had returned her own words to her across a long table with perfect precision, who had asked rather than informed, and waited rather than commanded, and carried a silver brooch in his hand for long enough to warm the metal. "I am aware of it too," she said, consistently. Something shifted in his face, that same almost thing that was adjacent to a smile, but this time it resolved. It became actual, brief and not performed, and entirely genuine. "Then we are in the same situation," he said. "It appears so," she said. They stood in the doorway for a moment longer, the torch between them, the snow falling in the courtyard beyond, and what passed between them in that moment did not require speech. It was the kind of understanding that arrived slowly, earned through weeks of proximity and honesty and care, and it settled now with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for some time, and had simply waited for the right moment to be acknowledged. "Sleep," he said eventually. "The council meets in the morning." "I know," she said. He turned to go. Paused once, as he had done in the great hall 2 months before. But this time he did not look back over his shoulder. This time he simply said, to the corridor ahead of him, "I am glad you stayed, Nellie of No House." She listened to his footsteps move away down the corridor and held the silver brooch in her palm until the warmth of it matched her own. Spring came. With it came Brenna's full report, which reshaped the kingdom's approach to wolf intuition medicine entirely, citing, in its opening pages, an Omega healer of the Ashenvale household whose intervention had demonstrated what trained instinct, continuous presence, and the willingness to remain, could accomplish where formal protocol had failed. The report named her. It used her name 3 times in the first page alone, and did not once refer to her rank. Aldrich retired to a quiet house in the eastern provinces. Warren took a position at a small village healer's hall. Petra, to Nellie's genuine pleasure, requested assignment to the Ashenvale Healers' Council, and proved to be considerably more capable than her silence during those 2 days in the sick room had suggested. Mab's kittens grew fat and opinionated, and absolutely refused to return to the lower kitchen. Nellie stopped trying. Cale recovered so completely that by spring he was leading training exercises in the courtyard at dawn, which Nellie observed from her window with the satisfied air of someone reviewing her own work. He found a young woman from the Southern Territories, a beta healer's daughter named Sela, sharp-minded and unimpressed by titles, and the way he looked at her confirmed, to Nellie's quiet contentment, that whatever had been frightened in him by the fever had healed without leaving anything permanently closed. And Tristan. There was no ceremony that winter, and none in early spring. What there was, instead, was a slow and honest accumulation of things. Mornings in the great hall when the council met, and he listened to her assessments with the same focused attention he gave his senior advisors. Evenings when he appeared at the door of the healer's wing with some pretext or other. A question about herbs, a guard's minor ailment, a book Cale had recommended that he thought she might find interesting, and stayed longer than the pretext required. Walks in the inner garden when it thawed, not arranged in advance, simply encountered, because they had both developed the habit of the garden at the same hour. He asked her, on a morning in late spring, when the apple trees in the courtyard had begun to blossom, and the smell coming through the open windows was green and sweet, and entirely unlike any winter she could remember, whether she would consider becoming a permanent part of his household, not as healer, as his chosen companion, his equal, as much as his station permitted, and more than it permitted in everything that mattered. She asked him if he was certain. He said, "I have been certain since the night I found you in that sick room. I was simply waiting until you were certain too." She looked at him, this king who had learned to ask instead of command, who carried warmth and silver and returned words like promises, who had given her a seat at a council table and a name that was hers, and a door she could open or close at will. "I am certain," she said. The wedding was small, by the standards of the kingdom. Lady Marin wept, which she denied. Cale stood at his father's side with an expression of profound satisfaction. Sela, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand and said nothing, which was the correct response. Petra threw rose petals with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for a reason to do so for some time. Nellie wore a gown of deep gray blue, the color of early morning, with her blonde hair braided and pinned with silver, the wolf brooch at her throat, warm from her skin, mid-stride and going somewhere. She had no house. She had never had one. Until now, she did. And when Tristan took her hand at the altar of the moon goddess, in the chapel of Ashenvale Keep, where the torches burned gold and the stone walls held the warmth of 3 generations, and said her name, just her name, with everything it now contained, she understood that the girl who had arrived at this keep with a gray cloak and a satchel of silver leaf, and no rank and nothing but the willingness to stay, had not been lost somewhere along the way. She had simply been waiting, as she always had, for the right moment to be found.